Good afternoon, all, and welcome to our webinar, Resilience by Design, Embedding Gender Rights into Corporate Sustainability. It's a pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon to really speak about a pertinent topic, such an important and pertinent topic. And this webinar is actually co-organized by UNDP in the lead up to our annual Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Rights in Asia conference to be held in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia on the 30th and the 31st of March, 2026. My name is Belinda Shatrayo. I am the Business and Human Rights Project Manager for UNDP Asia and the Pacific. Allow me to give you a brief introduction about this webinar and what we aim to achieve. Over the past 5 years, we've seen steady increase in pressure for companies to report on their rights footprint. What do we mean by rights footprint? Whether it's through human rights due diligence, increased disclosures, whether it's nature, climate, looking at their risks and their impact. Terms such as ESG, human rights and environmental due diligence, or HREDD, have become commonplace in our language, at least, as pressures from governments, trading partners, financial institutions continue to rise. I already see some hands up, and before I actually finish my introduction, I would want to also say there will be lots of time to have these conversations, and this is a key, I think, note on the excitement on having conversations around how do we embed gender in these discussions around ESG, HREDD. This element of gender equality has long been recognized, but it's sorely underrepresented when we look at corporate disclosures, when we look at due diligence measures, in particular, when we look at corporate impacts on women's rights. The World Benchmarking Alliance notes that fewer than 1 in 4 companies publicly disclose basic gender disaggregated data. What do we mean by that? Gender pay gap, grievance mechanisms. And yet, women's contributions in terms of industrial contributions are large. Also, the impact of the current triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate, and nature has women at the forefront, at the front lines of this conversation. So when we look at who is impacted by this crisis, when we look at who is not represented, we keep coming back to the same central question, the same central thesis around gender equality. When we talk about women on the front lines, recent data suggests that women are rapidly at risk of facing increased workloads, safety risks, and at least 4 out of 5 of those displaced by climate impacts will be women. Hence, today's conversation is timely. How do we make sure that gender equality does not fall by the wayside, but remains central to discussions around corporate sustainability and corporate accountability? It would be remiss of me not to note that this week we are celebrating and looking at the 70th Commission on the Status of Women, really under the theme of ensuring and strengthening access to justice and looking at structural barriers to access to justice. Remedy, grievance mechanisms, corporate accountability, all fall within this theme. Finally, I do want to quickly note that you will hear a lot of acronyms in this discussion. You'll hear ESG, HREDD, which is Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence. You will hear Task Force on Nature-related disclosures. You will hear about Task Force on Climate-related disclosures. You'll hear a lot of these. But essentially, I want you to remember that it all comes down to similar methodologies. Corporates are now increasingly required to, step 1, identify and assess their risks and impacts, prioritize them, address them, and communicate them. So, come what may, please do remember these 4 key steps, because this is what we are going to be talking about. How do we make sure that whether we're looking at different frameworks, different disclosures, how do we keep gender equality central? Now, before I introduce the illustrious panel, I would like to first start off by asking everyone to respond to a quick poll. The poll will remain live throughout our conversation, but we want to hear first from you. We want to hear questions around: what do you see as Southeast Asia's most pressing sustainability challenges? In your opinion, who is often overlooked in the design of climate and environmental strategies? Also, to hear from you, how well is gender integrated into corporate sustainability strategies in Southeast Asia? Does your company highlight the gender component while assessing human rights and environmental issues? What, in your opinion, is the biggest barrier? What do you see as the strongest business case? What actions do you think should be taken? And which sector do you think gender responsive measures are most urgently needed? We'll keep this poll ongoing throughout the course of the webinar, and you'll be able to access it on the screen. We also encourage you to share any questions you may have in the QA box, as well as the chat box, so that we may also know who is joining and where you're from. Now, without much further ado, I would like to introduce the panel. Today, I am joined by Lani Harijanti, Regional Program Implementation Manager, ASEAN, at Global Reporting Initiative; Salil Tripathi, Senior Advisor Global Issues at the Institute for Human Rights and Business; Eva Bortolotti, Program Specialist Environmental Finance, UNDP; and Natasha Gacha, Senior Director, Impact Investment Exchange, Steering Committee Member, Orange Movement, and author of Gender Equality and Climate Security, The Athenian Edge. I'll start first with Salil. Salil, how does failing to consider gendered human rights impacts undermine a company's risk anticipation and its responsibility to prevent harm?
Thank you, Belinda, and hello to everybody, and I hope I'm audible. Well, the first point is that if you don't look at gender and if you don't consider gender as a crucial part of your assessment of risks, then basically you have a blind spot. Because women, men, and gender diverse people have different responses and different needs and different ways of seeking and accessing their rights. The discrimination that they face tends to be different. So anything that adopts a kind of a blandly gender neutral approach is going to miss out on a lot of subtleties. So gender neutrality is a good desired end when everything is equal, but we are not there yet. I mean, in spite of 70 years of CSW and 45 years of CEDAW and 30 years of Beijing. I mean, that's where we are. So, but if we let's be concrete about it. If we look at the apparel manufacturing industry in South and Southeast Asia, the gender impacts are crucial because women form a large part of the workforce. In some countries, in the majority, and in some countries, at least 30 to 40%. And yet they face sexual harassment. They are not able to unionize. They don't have the benefits that they should have them by right, including maternity, and they are not able to raise grievances in a clear and competent, in a clear way, through a competent grievance mechanism. So that's one area. The other is we should look at extractive and mining industries. Again, the examples I have are sub-Saharan African one, where land acquisition becomes an issue because companies need land. And if they have not looked at female-owned homes and sometimes children-owned homes, because in conflict situations, that's what you're going to have, where young girls and women will be owning property because the parents have been killed. If that's not anticipated properly, that also causes harm. Another example is technology and AI. the algorithms either crowd out the voices of women, which are not understood, or there is harassment or hate speech and the silencing of women who are then not able to come. So it might seem that, the attacks have gone down against women, but that's because women are no longer on the platform. And I think, therefore, the content providers have a major responsibility in that area. And finally, the infrastructure and construction projects, both in South Asia and in the Middle East, sometimes women do work in these fields and they have particular vulnerabilities. Safety and security are issues, both in terms of the time they work at and the kind of equipment they have, the safety equipment that they need, and very often these are not taken into account. So if a robust mechanism is not developed, and if a mechanism fails to address these, then you are going to have an inadequate assessment of the situation and improper and inefficient understanding of the situation that the company is in.
Thank you, Salil. Actually, you've really taken us through quite a number of industries, right? So we've got construction, we've got in the context of AI and technology, we've got apparel industry, etc. And here, I think you've kind of outlined key areas where there are blind spots in these sectors when it comes to women's rights. And as you said, we miss out on the nuances. I'd like to just quickly also turn to Natasha, who has been working on a framing to look at crisis. So building on what Salil said is, if you look at a human security lens and you look at the climate crisis, there are really some signals that women could actually, if you frame the conversation around gender equality, it could be an early warning system for companies on climate risks. Natasha, this is quite a bold statement. So building on what Salil has just presented, just let us know why you see this as kind of an early warning system for climate security risks.
Thank you very much, Belinda, and to everyone else who's joined us today, because this is indeed a very important topic. This is a time of unprecedented global change, whether you're looking at climate, conflict, or artificial intelligence. And I think one of the things that's been really fascinating for me is that my research at the University of Oxford and Harvard University really focused on climate security. 40% of the wars fought over the last 60 years were fought over energy, water, and land, pressure points for climate. I come from the Himalayas, and we were at war last year, and water was being weaponized. And I think it's really an interesting time for us to see not just what the problems are, but what are the solutions. And so a lot of my research didn't focus just on the qualitative lens of this, but quantitative. So I ran a regression analysis at university to look at what is the greatest predictor of peace and security. What is the likelihood a country would go to war or not, especially under the increasing influence and pressures that climate change has created. Climate change is the biggest threat multiplier of war that we have today. And it was interesting because when I tested this, the strongest, most consistent predictor was a state's level of gender equality. It was stronger than GDP, democracy, latitude, religions, or geographic contiguity. And I think that's really fascinating. And the reason is because the way you treat a penalty-free target at home is the way you will treat them internationally. You will treat someone you perceive to be weaker across the border the same way you treat someone you perceive to be weaker at home. So it's stood out as this fascinating predictor. I do have a slide if we could pull it up very briefly. And I think what I found when I was doing the mapping of this framework is that if you put the women, peace, and security agenda at the very center, there's an Athenian edge, as I call it. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, and Ares, her brother, is the god of war. And both of them achieve victories in Greek mythology in different ways. And Athena really focuses on preventing bloodshed through strategic insights, whereas Ares still focuses on victory, but doing through force and aggression. And I think that's what I found through the research, is that if you allow women to prevent climate change by increasing their participation in the green workforce, energy, manufacturing, or transportation, you were seeing countries like Singapore, Sweden, two countries, one in the south, one in the north, were incredibly good at building climate security. They are least likely to go to war, even though in different parts of the world. One thing they had in common was climate change. Similarly, if you look to the right, if you allow women to protect, they have a natural tendency to protect natural assets because they grow 70% of the food we eat. They spend 250 million hours collecting water. They are natural stewards of the environment. And because of all these factors, you would see in the framework that women are playing an incredible role across 12 dimensions of climate security. So what does this mean for corporates? There are two axes I've drawn here. On the right is the policy side, but on the left is the finance side. And I think this is important for corporates because you could design your sustainable equity, debt, or investment strategies to align with these sectors to understand how you are facing risks of climate change, how you are facing risks of national security, which are unfortunately true risks no matter where you are in the world, whether you're in Europe or in the Middle East. These are real risks that we are seeing capital being shifted towards defense. How do you then actually design structures that use women to stabilize your risk, improve your return, and also therefore deepen your impact on these very critical areas? So very happy to share more about the framework, the thesis and the regression analysis, but that's the gist of it, is that it's a extremely strong predictor and corporate managers need to take this very seriously because it will not only affect your impact reports, but your emissions data, your asset exposure, your insurance losses, and your supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And it's a very, very interesting framework. And there's also recently published research by IUCN that talks about the depletion of natural resources and the link to gender-based violence and why corporates should be keeping a close eye and a keen eye on this. Just very quickly, I'm cognizant that both you and Salil have spoken about resources, water, land, and being a multiplier, and the climate crisis being a multiplier of some of these risks that we see. I'd like to turn to somebody who works with probably one of the most talked about frameworks that are on nature-related risks. Eva, we see so many different frameworks coming up. I think Natasha has shared one, but then, of course, you've seen, for example, I've shared human rights and environmental due diligence, and there's TCFD, and there are quite a number of different frameworks that look at resources and how companies can better report and disclose their risks, report and disclose their impacts. My question is to you. How do we make sure that we incorporate gender equality into nature strategies without creating so many parallel systems, without having kind of reporting paralysis, as some companies call it?
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you for having me today. And I think, thank you also for bringing this intersection between biodiversity loss, ecosystems loss, and gender and social inequality issues. And for those of us that followed, the World Economic Forum and the latest Global Risks report, they might have seen that, social inequality and ecosystems loss really come at the top of global risks for humanity and for our economies in the long and short term. So these are very interconnected issues. And in terms of your questions of the entry points, I think there are three main entry points that we need to consider here. And the first one comes to interoperability, which is a difficult word, but basically it's about how all these frameworks and standards connect together to each other. Many companies, as you say, maybe already report on nature, on climate, on social issues, or maybe they're starting to, through the use of these multiple frameworks and standards, but maybe they're not aware that very often these frameworks and standards are very much designed to work with each other. And you did mention some of them today. We have, for example, at the framework level, the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. That was the first one to lay down a system to help companies to assess climate risk. Similarly, we have the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, of which UNDP is one of the co-founders as supporters, that indeed focuses on the nature and ecosystem loss aspects, that a company needs to assess. But also there are also new frameworks in this this context, we have the task force on inequality and social related financial disclosures that started very recently, and is also bringing up the issues indeed on social equality, and among which, of course, also gender. But what is important to remember, even so there are so many acronyms and there might be confusion, is that all these frameworks draw from and fit to international standard systems, such as those of the Global Reporting Initiative, for example, that we have here today. I'm sure we will have a colleague sharing more about that, but also those of the International Sustainability Standard Board, the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So the system is very much interconnected. If you think about the TCFD on climate, it has been embedded into the IFRS S1 standards that are already used by S2 standards, apologies, on climate that are already used by many companies to assess financial risk on climate around the world. And similarly, the International Sustainability Standard Board has recently announced that they are building a new research for a potential standard on nature-related issues that will be published in draft format before COP17 this year. So that's kind of a big moment in terms of alignment of different standards and frameworks, specifically on nature. And I believe ISSB is also in parallel making a research on human rights issues at the same time. So I think a company, when start looking at the different climate, nature, social inequality aspects, really should look at this interoperability. And there are already many resources existing. For example, there is already an interoperability table available between the Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI standards, and the TNFD framework on nature. So the company could just, take that table and look at the different interoperability aspects. And if they're already using one standard or one framework, just align their reporting system. And everything is slowly, coming together under different standards and frameworks that are already adopted by many jurisdictions, sometimes even in mandatory format around the world. And so nature-related framework increasingly align, and companies might map existing social and gender data, for example, so that the same information can support multiple disclosure requirements. Let's take, for example, governance data. Governance and decision-making data can inform both nature oversight from the board and gender inclusion, or, for example, value chain and community data can help us claim how nature impacts and affect different groups, right? And I think on this specific point, the second thing that we need to take into consideration is the importance of embedding gender into the existing materiality assessment and risk assessment process of a companies. There's no need for a completely separate system. You can embed gender considerations since the very beginning of your nature risk assessment, for example. So companies can expand and include gender differentiated impacts and vulnerabilities, and that might include, for example, how ecosystem degradation affects livelihoods across genders, supply chain specific risks. Let's take into account that, for example, if you are undertaking a gender blind assessment, you might overlook how women have a central role in agriculture, fisheries, forest value chains, all value chains that, for example, Southeast Asia are very, very relevant. And in this way, you might overlook certain productivity risks for the companies if you don't take into account that specific role. So the lack of gender disaggregated data, for example, in a nature risk assessment, can lead to underestimate the exposure to very specific risk for a company. So the idea here is really to treat gender inequality, for example, as a material risk amplifier. So even more important for the company to take it into consideration since the very beginning of the risk assessment, and not as a tick in the box exercise. And then maybe the third point, I think, is to promote capacity building on this integration of these different aspects, both like capacity building internally for the company across different departments. Very often, this kind of expertise is distributed. There might be a sustainability department with specific climate experts, human rights experts, which is amazing to have, but of course also raise the awareness that these are interconnected issues and they cannot be treated separately. And I think on that, Belinda, our work together with you and the business and human rights team and the nature team has been very amazing in looking at how business and human rights approach can, contribute to both net zero and nature positive strategies, and creating training material and awareness and capacity building initiatives on that. I think it's a very important step for the companies to kind of move ahead in this process and recognize kind of the gender nature linkages. So just maybe to wrap up, I would say that strengthening this ability of companies to work across nature and inequality issues, they can produce then disclosure that are not only more coherent and aligned with the international standards and framework, but also like more credible and ultimately more useful for managing the risks. So yeah, I would say these are the kind of the three key points today.
Thank you so much, Ava. I mean, that's a lot of information, but actually important information to say, you know what, you can look, all of these standards were created with the same spirit and are linked with international standards, right? So regardless of how you cut the cake, as it were, you can look at interoperability frameworks to see how can you kind of collect gender disaggregated data that would help you in your climate reporting and your nature reporting, and of course your human rights reporting. I think what I'm also taking away from this is, gender is a material risk multiplier. So really kind of having that imperative, even from the corporate level, to say, hey, look at the departments need to work together on this, actually just produces better disclosure and also due diligence results. I want to turn over to Lani from GRI, who has a bird's eye view of all of these different standards that have been mentioned, all these different frameworks. Lani, I mean, how are we doing in terms of incorporating gender? I mean, I think we've heard from Salil and Ava and Natasha that there is these frameworks that kind of speak to the same spirit, that all make room for gender equality. But how are Asian companies doing, and where's the biggest gap? Is it data quality? Is it the supply chain? Is it looking at materiality of risks?
Okay, thank you, Belinda. So for the Asian region, I think we have come quite a long way in terms of ESG disclosure and sustainability disclosure. If you track through the trend on the disclosures, based on the latest, I think Deloitte issue Women at Work research result in 2025, if you take a look at the trend, there has been a significant increase in terms of inclusion of women in the workforce and at the board level. I think almost everyone going to at least double, but they go up to triple and quadruple numbers in the inclusion of women in the workforce. Now, in terms of disclosure, this one is easier to track. Almost all exchanges and regulator, they will require the issuers to record the number of women on the board level, and then the number of women at the executive level. With the GRI, we do require them to disaggregate the data at the level of operational unit office. One of the biggest challenges is collecting the data at the supply chain level, especially if it's going to tier 2 and tier 3. And then if the supplier is actually not 100% working for you, then the accountability of the number is becoming a big problem on which one should be counted in the report. So that is one issue. But for own operation, no problem with collecting the gender data. By now, I think almost the 6 capital market in Asian, every single one of them issue some sort of disclosure only related to women inclusion in the workforce and in the board. But in terms of how women is featured under the community engagement, I don't think it's disclosed specifically on like the number of women reach out through their, let's just say, corporate responsibility work aside from the workers. So that is a big challenge. Not sure whether there is a good analysis on this one. I don't think I see quite enough analysis related to this. So the question is, do we need them to disclose about this, or do we need them just to share some of the progress that they made, the impact at the local community, and how they, change the life of the people on the ground? So that's it. But also, of course, the minute we put more requirement, it means the report is getting to more than 100 pages, which is right what is happening right now. So in terms of trend, we are okay. But I think between business and development, we are looking at different expectation on how far the disclosure can go and how far we can include informations on a sustainability report. No problem in own operation. A big challenge with supply chain data, especially with daily labor, contract labor, not a long-term labor. We have problem with methodology, and please do remember this is business people. They not many of them hire researcher to work on the data management. So business usually do what they can based on requirement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lani. And I think you've kind of also specified I think three quick takeaways from here. One is disclosure, especially when it comes to inclusion, is very, very high. We're seeing companies are happily and readily kind of disclosing on their own operations. But where it gets tricky is when you start looking at tier 2, tier 3, when you start looking at accountability issues, when you start looking at local level impacts, gendered impacts, that's where things start to get tricky and it's difficult to validate. I'm going to go off script a little bit here and maybe welcome Salil to kind of talk us through some of this accountability piece and I think the local level piece that Lani mentioned. You know, one of the key things that World Benchmarking Alliance data shows is that even though sometimes companies disclose their gender plans, is the implementation where things really do weaken. And I think further than that, if you look a little bit deeper, it's the accountability, the remedial pathways that are really faltering and really stopping some progress. Now, to you, Salil, what access to remedy pathways would you suggest to companies to really embed women's rights as part of their human rights and environmental due diligence strategies? Maybe you can help us unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the gaps that exist are very real because, one of the problems with any numerical accounting for accountability tends to be that you can measure only what can be measured. And there are many things that need to be measured, which cannot be measured. So one old example, which came from Latin America and applies to many places, is that security forces were very pleased that the number of complaints that they had this year were substantially less than last year. And therefore, they thought that the security forces were acting responsibly. But you don't have to be a human rights specialist or a gender specialist to know that sometimes people have simply given up reporting because they have no faith in the system. They have no trust in the system. So the remedy pathways that need to be examined particularly have to look at it from the perspective of transparency, because without it, the access to remedy is significantly weakened. If companies don't see women in the data, and if they try to see it only through data, then the harms remain totally structurally invisible and legally very, very risky. And so, I mean, one of the ways that one can look at it is more finely tuned, listening-oriented, operation level grievance mechanism where, there's complete freedom. And there can be, there's always the issue about what is universal and what is local. And again, we know examples that there are certain cultures where the village chiefs, who tend to be men, do not like women to be consulted by large corporations. And there are ways around it to meet them only in women's schools, as it has been done in Indonesia in the past, because the other system prevents that. And therefore, you do it in the school, and the questioners, the interrogators, are school teachers who are female. So I think there are creative ways in which you do to understand, listen, and so that your OLGM, sorry to use an acronym here, but that's the operational level grievance mechanism, is more fine-tuned and more in keeping with the need. The other is a third-party investigation mechanism. I think it's very important that the investigation that is being undertaken is not necessarily undertaken by company alone, but in partnership with either local civil society groups, local academics, local schools, local people who have credibility in the system, not necessarily politicians. I'm not going there. And the remedy has to be gender specific and what women really want. And I think that's where also sometimes things go wrong, because I think the approach that often comes up is that, okay, let's build a road, but probably what they want is not a road, but maybe they just want a few trees to be planted where women can gather in the afternoon. And this is again an example from Mali in Africa, where the company tried to listen to it. It was a mining company from Zimbabwe, which ended up getting it right after several false starts. So I think that's another one. And then the supplier level remedies, and I think the good example we have, which is now quite well known, is what happened after Rana Plaza, because you had a major disaster, a building collapse, nearly 1,100 workers died, and major brands were buyers there, and they thought, and I think so. I think it was Lanny who mentioned earlier that you are a manufacturer and you're reliant on many companies that you are servicing to. So what is the leverage point there? So here the buyers came together and created both the accord and the alliance, and then the system, of course, then got transformed. But there has been a global application out of that, and you have a system where there are requirements for factory safety. And there has been one major disaster earlier this year in Bangladesh, no doubt about it. But we know that it was a factory that was not part of the accord system. So I think there are ways and ways in which we can work to look at some of the grievance mechanisms, which are direct, practical, on the ground, relevant, and specific.
I like what you said, Celia. I mean, on a number of different levels, I did see you got a round of applause in a number of different places. And I think it's because it resonates, right? We want to make sure that what's on paper in terms of corporate policy, in terms of whether it's zero tolerance policies, whether it is to include gender dimensions and nature-related strategies, that we actually realize and we actually are designing systems that are fit for purpose, not just to say on paper, this is what the situation is, but all the way to grievances. Are there open pathways to seek remedy? You do introduce an interesting point, though, when it comes to this idea of hearing the voices on the ground. And you've given us 3 practical examples. I want to quickly just turn over to Ava, very quickly, Ava, because just to illustrate that this is not just the realm of human rights, but it is also embedded in nature-related due diligence as well. How is the nature field, if I may put it that way, dealing with these gender-differentiated impacts? Particularly, I'm looking at stakeholder engagement and making sure that women's voices are heard. Over to you, Ava.
Thank you, Belinda. I'll try to be very quick on this, but I will share one slide just to help us to have a bit of visual, since of course these are complex frameworks. But I think one important thing to consider is that as part of the risk assessment processes, business should specifically consider, of course, the gender impacts and vulnerabilities and dependencies of the company. And when assessing nature-specific related risks, the for example, has developed a methodology, which is called the LEAP approach, which is a recommended, risk and opportunity assessment approach for use for the companies and financial institutions. We will not have time, of course, to go into every detail of the LEAP approach today, but as you can see from the slide, it is composed of different phases. The locate phase, where the company identifies where the organization interfaces with nature across operations. The evaluate phase, where the company assesses dependencies and impacts on nature. The assess phase, where the company moves to assessing risks and opportunities that are related to those dependencies and impacts. And finally, the prepare phase, where all these findings are integrated together and eventually disclosed. And across this methodology, there is also a stakeholder engagement framework that is also very available for consultation online, and I'm happy to share in the chat later. And I've seen some people were asking in the Q&A, which data can we collect? What can we do, across this framework to collect gender data? And I think this framework, the LEAP approach and the connected stakeholder engagement framework to the LEAP approach can really help you to answer those questions. So basically, there is guidance available to help companies perform stakeholder engagement across the LEAP process and across different groups. Of course, all affected stakeholders can be considered in this process, gender groups, but also indigenous people and local communities and other affected stakeholders. And in the slides here, for example, you can see at the bottom, these are the different phases of the LEAP approach. And at the bottom, there are some of the examples of the many engagement questions that a company should undertake when doing the LEAP approach. So for example, in the locate phase, there are different areas of the operations that where the company might interface with nature. And there, the company should identify if there are specific groups which might be predominantly, composed of women sometimes, that might be impacted by the activities. In the evaluate phase, they should, evaluate those impacts, but also evaluate the opinions of these gender differentiated groups about those impacts, And often gender differentiated roles shape how and who depends on which ecosystem services. I think a very concrete example is, for example, the ecosystem service of water. In many cultures, women are the ones that are more responsible for water collection. And therefore, if the water sources are contaminated by the company, they are the ones that might be more exposed to risks together with their families, and maybe maternal health risks and other related risks. Moving then to the assess phase, the company should evaluate those risks. And for example, if women limited access and control over land and property is encountered, this might also restrict their ability to equitably share the profits in the sectors that we mentioned before at the beginning, like agriculture and forestry. And so excluding women from consultation, decision making, and benefit sharing of resources can only exacerbate existing inequality and increase, social risks. So just to wrap up, I really think that those gender responsive action can reduce risk and unlock opportunity. And a nature risk assessment, for example, is strongest only when stakeholder engagement, including also gender consideration, is treated as a source of insight and opportunity, and not just, as a compliance step. So I'll just stop sharing this here, but happy to, answer any additional questions in the chat if helpful.
Thank you so much, Eva. I know it's always really great to see kind of practically where can we actually design, how companies can actually design gender-specific measures. And it's actually heartening to see that the LEAP approach very much, as I've expressed to you earlier, it very much mirrors human rights due diligence strategies as well, right? So with locate, identifying your risks and impacts, and so on and so forth. So just cognizant of time, I think it'll be great to move on to the Q&A section, because I do see that there are a number of questions that have already been left in the chat. To everybody joining us online, please do feel free to add your question, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. I think the first question is really to Lani, looking at, what indicators or metrics are most useful for tracking impact on gender, looking at the broader sustainability frameworks that exist. What would you say are the key metrics for tracking used by GRI?
Okay. I think we should take a look at the newest GRI labor topic standard. So if you notice, we split right now, I think related to well-being, there are like 4 different disclosures. We track about the maternity leave, parental leave, caregiver leave. It's one on its own. And then there is also a component about well-being. What else? Yeah? You can check the website. If I'm not mistaken, now it's becoming like 12 to 16 different topic standard. It's really encompassing. the main difference right now, GRI usually only, ask for a bulk number, like your own operation, and as far as you can go, the workers. But now I think in almost every level, they split it into two, the requirement, disclose about your own operation, and then the second layer is disclose about the worker that is under your control in your supply chain. So there are changes. Hopefully everyone will be happy if company will be able to comply to this. I think the data will be rich. The only concern right now, I think you will have a very good data range to take a look at the impact among workers. We still need to see how far we can tweak the one that measure the impact at the community. But I think we have the human rights due diligence component. So if you do it well, the human rights due diligence component, and it's communicated into a public report, hopefully on sustainability report or standalone human rights report, you will be able to pick up how company actually identify their impact also on using on gender lens, and also looking at how company is actually managing that impact and tracking whether it's solving the issue or not. So there are two things. Take a look at the GRI topic standards on labor issue, and then try to find the human rights report from company. You will see a lot of gender dimension supposed to be appearing on there, but you will see a little bit more on the story, not only about the number. I think that's the way to do it.
Thank you, Lani, and also very heartening to know that this is a space that's ever evolving, and there are, as you said, kind of these new labor standards, and they're really trying to get behind the data, as it were, to what's the meat behind the data, what are the stories behind the data, and there's also room to improve, to include that community voice, so that at least we also hear from women rights holders at the community level who might be impacted. The next question is actually for Natasha, because I see there are quite a few questions here on the role of investors, the role of financial institutions. So Natasha, what are the top three proof points you look to see if businesses are truly taking a gender responsive model? So before you invest, what are you looking out for? It'll be great to hear from you on that.
Thank you. Might pull up the framework to make this a bit of a swifter answer, but basically, I think, look, having worked on Wall Street and having worked in sustainable finance now for over a decade, and Wall Street before that, during the financial crisis of 2008, I can tell you a key part of me designing this framework, the left-hand side axis on finance is all triggered on two dimensions, risk and return. If you cannot speak that language, it is very difficult to argue for gender or any sustainability metric to be put in as a proof point. So with that context, let me share. So say you have a very low risk tolerance and you are going for investment grade countries, you may want to focus on sectors which are aligned to that. So you would see sectors like energy, manufacturing, transport are still good for you. You can get a good return. You can have low risk. But the proof point that you would look for is to say, gender disaggregated data, as many of us have mentioned. But what does that mean in terms of the green transition? Are women actually getting green jobs in manufacturing? If you have a more risk tolerance and say you are a foundation or you are, the CSR arm of a company and you want to switch to program related investments, you are a bank that is working in an emerging market, I would switch to looking at sectors as you see, like when you're thinking about food security, when you're thinking about water security, and then you're looking at supply chains, or say the women farmers that you have, you're not just counting the number of women farmers, but you're seeing, do they have bank accounts? You're seeing whether if they are part of a microcredit program, whether it's a fair rate of interest. This is not just because it is interesting to have from gender, but it's a proof point for me to understand if you understand the risks. Do you understand whether these women have been climate resilient trained? Do they have the capital to sustain a climate shock? And do they have the right pricing so that they will repay you at the end of the day, especially if you're using a debt instrument? So I think once you start mapping it in that way, and then if you go all the way down, you are a much riskier country, you're looking at something like infrastructure in a developing country, then you are looking at gender insights influencing CapEx decisions, site selection, sourcing. And I think once you lay that in there, not only are you mitigating your risk, you're also balancing out your return. And that's the real power of investing in gender equality is women tend to be risk averse. They tend to have these longer horizons when they think about how to manage capital, and that is actually your strength in investment. And if you're putting in gender just as a checkbox, as I think Eva mentioned, then it's not enough for us. If you're using it as your investment strategy, and if you're using it as risk intelligence as per the framework, then we can invest. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Blunt, but helpful.
It certainly is. It certainly is. And I know that there's still many, many questions in the chat. So please feel free to respond to the interactive poll. If there are any questions that we do not get to, we'll try and get to via email. But just maybe one quick question to everybody on the panel. If there was one key message that you would like everybody here to leave with, one key message and one key outcome in 10 seconds or less, what would it be? Let's start off with Natasha, and then we'll go over to Lani, Salil, and then Eva.
One key message are women are not just victims of poverty and inequality. They are the solutions to economic stability, transformation, and a more climate resilient future for corporates and the economies that they serve. Thank you.
My turn? Oh, well, for me, because I'm coming from disclosure part, so please disclose and please disaggregate the data. The one thing that company keeps forgetting is that they need to explain. There is the so-called management approach. So you are supposed to put a little bit more information on how you are actually managing that issue. That is one. The last one, for all those that are non-reporter or not from business, please send your feedback to the company. There is this mechanism under sustainability reporting so that, they can improve the way they disclose. So you need to send a feedback. You need to send a question. Everything is public. If there is no if there is no questions, company thought they are doing okay. Thank you.
Salil, over to you.
Yeah, no, just to say that, don't look at the external cosmetic statistics and so on, but look at what lies within. I mean, a company may have 65% of its workforce to be women, which may look very good until you find that 60% of them actually are at the factory floor and there are only 2 or 3 people at the top. So look beneath the data and examine the data and question it.
I think it's me next. So maybe based on what we mentioned before, that really, gender equality can be one of the most effective risk management approaches for a company. So I think that is what I wanted to convey a bit today.
Fantastic. And I think there are lots of key messages to draw from here. Before I thank our panelists for the great overview, I want to maybe just end off on 2 key things. One is to say that, this and many more discussions will be had during the Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Rights in Asia conference happening in Kuala Lumpur on the 30th and the 31st of March. And we welcome those who are interested to join. We'll also be launching a number of tools, including the guide that Eva mentioned, which is a human rights, a business and human rights approach to net zero and nature positive strategies. Now, without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our business and human rights portfolio lead for Asia and the Pacific, Dr. Harpreet Kaur, to just give us some quick reflections. And I know she's tasked with tying all of this together and kind of giving us the key outcomes. Over to you, Harpreet.
Thank you, Belinda, and thank you to all the panelists for a conversation. I think that was very, very rich, but also really grounded in practice. I will actually not even try to summarize what's all been discussed and what's been said. I think it is quite a big challenge, but I do want to reflect on probably like a few shared learnings that really crystallized over the course of today's discussion. I was kind of taking very, very copious notes, so you're going to have to bear me with that. I think first of all, probably gender came through clearly as a way of seeing risk earlier rather than more accurately. In fact, one idea that stayed with me is that gender acts as an early warning signal. When companies do not understand how climate, nature, and environmental impacts affect women differently, they're not being neutral. I think something Salil said, they're actually leaving gaps in the risk radar. Think again, Salil said what's invisible at the assessment stage often becomes costly at the implementation stage. And I think that's something that all the panelists have said in many different ways. And often what happens is that those blind spots later show up as labor instability, as disrupted supply chains, community tensions, but also as loss of trust. So I think somewhere, to kind of start seeing gender early on, rather than kind of, like really, really starting taking it as an early warning system. I think the second thing that was today reinforced was that the real challenge is not really the ambition, but really designing systems that are fit for purpose. There was a stronger reminder that policies on paper, zero tolerance commitments, gender policies, sustainability strategies, all of these only matter if they translate into how risks are being identified, how decisions are made, and also how grievances are handled. I think that one line that resonated, and I've made notes, I hope I'm attributing it correctly, but it was also said that it's not enough to say the right things, but really the test is whether pathways to raise concerns and seek remedy are actually open. And I think that shift from statements to systems is where really credibility and trust is built. The third lesson that I'm sort of taking away from this discussion is that integration matters more than ever. I think we heard consistently that companies are struggling not because there are too many new frameworks or there are too few frameworks, but because there are just too many that feel disconnected. I think there's like, how do you bring in that integration? And the message today in somehow was really, really reassuring that this is not about creating parallel gender or nature system. It is really about whether you're looking at through human rights and environmental due diligence or nature-related risk approaches like LEAP, the logic is strikingly similar. Identify where you interface with risk, understand who is affected, assess impacts and dependencies, and then respond. And when gender is embedded into these existing processes, including stakeholder engagement, it becomes a source of insight rather than as an additional burden, which was something that was seen earlier. Fourth, I think one of the key lessons is that accountability and remedy are where all of this really, really becomes real. You can have frameworks, you can have discussions, you can have policies in place, but all of this really becomes real when you look at through it accountability and remedy lens. And I think a powerful reminder today was that fewer companies do not always mean fewer harms. It's it's like fewer complaints do not always mean fewer harms. And sometimes they really mean that people have stopped trusting the system and they're not using the grievance mechanisms as well. So if grievance mechanisms are inaccessible, unsafe, or disconnected from local realities, harm remains invisible, gender responsive, listening-based grievance and remedy pathways. I think these are the ones that shape around how women actually raise concerns. All of these are very essential, not just for justice, but also for effective risk management. And I think across all the conversation today, one idea that kept resurfacing is to sort of gender inequality does not create new risk. It actually reveals where risk concentrates. So when companies treat gender as a risk intelligence, I think Natasha said in her sort of closing remarks also, whether it's in supply chain or nature dependent sector or investment decisions, they are actually better equipped to anticipate disruption, manage uncertainty, and build resilience over the long term. It also felt like the conversation actually is today maturing. I'm actually really pleased to see so many people joining, but I think also, just in terms of how the conversation seems to be maturing, and we've kind of moved beyond questions asking why gender matters to actually asking how it changes decisions on the ground, from site selection and stakeholder engagement to data collection and grievance design and capital allocation. I think that I see as a really big shift, even from the last couple of years that we've seen conversations in this space. And it's not an easy shift, but it really is a necessary one. And I think if we don't act it now, I don't know, when we're gonna do that, or if there's gonna be enough time for that. So with that, I think again, thank you very much for all the panelists for the depth, but I think also just for the honesty that they brought to this discussion today, and to everyone who joined and engaged so actively. We will continue this conversation in different spaces over the coming months. Belinda had already mentioned the Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Rights Conference, Environmental Rights in Asia Conference, taking place on 30th and 31st March in Malaysia. Please do look at the website, and we hope to see you in Malaysia and continue the dialogue. But thank you everyone for joining.